Alright, so something that I frequently talk about on this channel is how the Supreme Court primarily exists to serve the interest of corporate America or the capitalist class. Another way of saying that is that we have a bunch of corrupt motherfuckers leading the highest court in the land. Thank you to Clarence Thomas for recently making that explicitly clear for everybody with your, $500,000 super yacht slash private jet trips with Harlan Crow, your billionaire buddy. But we got basically a story here that is giving us a perfect insight into not only who the Supreme Court serves, but also the bipartisan nature when it comes to decisions that directly affect workers or directly affect the bottom line of corporate America. So, as pointed out here by More Perfect Union, they say, breaking: the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of a concrete company that wanted to sue a union because a strike cost them money. Okay, so they're trying to sue them. Now, we're going to get into all the specifics surrounding this, individual case, but a strike that costs them money. The entire point of having a union is so that you have the collective ability with your fellow workers to go on strike to then cause economic harm in the short term to your company, which then gives you more leverage in the negotiations for whatever contract happens to be on the table. The whole point of going on strike is to cause some degree of economic harm to the company, right? That's the whole thing. Okay, so by going after that, they're essentially trying to undermine the ability for unions to actually utilize their leverage, while having this hanging threat over their head that potentially they could get sued by their company for the economic harm that they may have caused. Okay, so a little bit more details here. They say the 8-1 decision. 8-1 decision, very bipartisan here, means that the company, Glacier Northwest Incorporated, can sue the union over a strike where truck drivers left wet concrete in their trucks. So we'll circle back around to the details of what exactly these workers did, because it seems like they went out of their way to try to make it so that these trucks would not be damaged, and yet they're still trying to bring this lawsuit, I guess, based on like a hypothetical that is really an issue that like the company should have been, tackling or preparing for in the first place, instead of just blaming the workers as they were going out on strike. But they say the one dissenting judge, Ketanji Brown Jackson, the most recent Supreme Court nominee under Biden, argues that the majority is inserting itself into an assessment of labor disputes that is lawfully the purview of the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, and that the Supreme Court is overstepping by even hearing this case. So, I mean, this is a core part of this, and understand, them taking up this case in the first place, regardless of what the inevitable ruling was, even them just deciding to take this case is explicitly to try to weaken the power that the NLRB has in these labor disputes. It's supposed to be under their authority to determine, okay, this was a legal action that was taken by these workers who were going on strike. This was illegal. Okay, obviously, I mean, there are boundaries to this, right? It's one thing to say that workers should be able to cause economic harm in the abstract by the lack of their labor value being inputted in a system when they go on strike, but it's another thing to say, like, okay, obviously they can't, vandalize property, right? They can't go and like throw rocks inside of Amazon headquarters or something while they're going on strike, okay? That would be off the table, but this is a different situation that should have just been under the NLRB's authority, and the Supreme Court decided to take up this case and obviously decided to rule in the way that they did. But they say she also argues that the court is putting the onus on workers and their union here, when it is actually incumbent on Glacier, the company, to take steps to negotiate with the union and mitigate their losses. Again, 100%, just the core fundamental reason why we have unions is because of this kind of situation. This is where all of the leverage comes, but instead, as Ketanji Brown Jackson is pointing out here, the Supreme Court is trying to put the onus on the workers to prepare for any potential economic harm that may come to the company as a result of the strike. No, that should be on the company itself to prepare for that, or I don't know, maybe pay your workers fair wages, maybe give them decent benefits and safe working conditions, and then they won't feel like they need to go on strike in the first place. I mean, all of this is entirely the fault of the corporation, as it is in pretty much every single situation where you see a labor dispute like this. But a little bit more details here. There was a great breakdown, and of course I'll link this thread down below from More Perfect Union. They obviously also put together a 4-minute video here that you can go watch if you want more of the background on this, but I think that this article that was written by Jane McAlevey, I want to say is how you pronounce that. Kind of weird that I can't pronounce that because my name is Macaulay, but McAlevey, Jane McAlevey, wrote a good basically piece here in The Nation where she breaks down some of the details, what this is going to mean for the labor movement moving forward, and all of that good stuff. So let's just go ahead and get into this. She says, how should workers respond to the Supreme Court's ruling in Glacier Northwest? So they say, today, Today's U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Glacier Northwest versus the International Brotherhood of Teamsters case was a blow to workers, but not quite the knockout punch that was hoped for by the Chamber of Commerce, which was backing the effort by Glacier Northwest to bring this lawsuit, right? The Chamber of Commerce obviously broadly represents corporate America, the interests of corporations in this country, so they're very anti-labor, to say the least. But they say despite the court's 8-1 decision favoring the employer, the justices made a relatively narrow ruling rather than the broad one that would weaken the entirety of the National Labor Relations Board even further than it already is being weakened. But they say in the future, the near future, labor will not be so lucky as to lose this lightly, and workers should get ready to fight what's coming. Okay, so it seems like it's like temporarily not as bad news as it otherwise could have been, depending on how they decided to rule on this. Pretty narrow ruling, but as she's going to get into here, they are very, very urgently trying to look for ways to expand this to basically undercut the entirety of the NLRB, along with a whole bunch of other, federal agencies as well that are a check on capital's power in this country. But she says first, the good news is, such as it is, today's decision leaves intact a long-held legal doctrine that's known as the Garmin preemption, and therefore keeps the NLRB as a decision maker on what constitutes reasonable precaution in workers' strikes. So the NLRB still kind of has that authority for now, but they say Cheerleaders for Free Enterprise were hoping to replace that long-established federal jurisdiction with a state-level tort law, and they say those cheerleaders didn't get all they wanted to. Just think about how insane that idea is, that instead of having an all-encompassing federal agency that hears these kinds of cases all the time, that understands the nuances and the depths of labor law and the legality of certain different actions in different contexts for these kinds of disputes, okay, and taking that away from a federal agency that's specific goal is to cover labor rights and cover worker protection, and instead putting it to the state courts, okay, where you might get some deranged right-wing lunatic, a jury or a lunatic, a judge in that kind of a situation, who might just decide to decide in whatever way he wants to on any given Tuesday, right? Somebody who doesn't know the actual law as they probably should, who doesn't understand the complexities and the depth of all of these different situations and the context-dependent factors that go into this and any of that stuff. You're going to try to lower this down to a state-level tort law so that you can just unleash a flood of lawsuits coming from corporations anytime that their workers want to go on strike? And the answer is yes, that's explicitly what they are trying to do by pushing that down to the state courts. They want to crush the ability for unions to go on strike without having that fear of being sued for ungodly amounts of money for some hypothetical economic harm they cause to the company. But so that was the good news. Okay, that was the good news. Now we get to the bad news. They say it's a harbinger of the future, and it's on full view in Justice Samuel Alito's concurring opinion, where he makes clear that he is ready and willing to kill this Garmin standard that keeps some of these decisions in the hands of the NLRB instead of state tort law. And they say he wants to kill it as soon as the court can get a better case with which to achieve this Chamber of Commerce objective. He's joined by other hardcore anti-labor ideologues on the court, like Justice Thomas and Gorsuch, in a second concurring opinion, revealing their hands so clearly that we can count. 3 justices are ready to totally eviscerate the NLRB as part of their determined campaign to gut the administrative state. And they say agency by agency, they're progressing when they get the chance, as we saw with this court that just did this with the EPA and basically stripped the ability for the EPA to make decisions based on the Clean Water Act, which Congress already designated them to have the authority to do so. But so we have 3 justices, right? Gorsuch, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito as well, and they're already looking for a broader case to try to just torch the NLRB, to rip it into a million pieces so that they can't effectively protect labor rights. And that's just the ones that we know based on their open statements that they've already come out with. Now, you could have other, Supreme Court justices. Obviously, we have a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court majority, so it certainly could be the case that a bunch of other ones would also side with them. And, given the 8-1 decision that was involved in this case, I mean, maybe even some liberals, would join on with them, even if they didn't have to. So, I mean, that's the current layout, right? But they continue with a little bit of history here on the specifics of this actual case of Glacier Northwest versus the Teamsters. They say Glacier has its origin in a 2017 contract dispute between Teamsters Local 174 and 5 cement companies in the Seattle area led by Glacier Northwest. They say drivers whose trucks still had concrete in them when a strike began took what they assert was reasonable precaution, which is the standard here, notifying management that they had left the trucks running so that the drums would continue rotating and the concrete would not harden and destroy the trucks. Okay, so they went out of their way to notify management, okay, and to keep the trucks running instead of shutting them off so that, you know, there would actually be direct harm to the trucks. In that case, I think you could make a much stronger case in favor of saying that it was somewhat of like vandalism, but even then, I think it would kind of be a stretch. But so they go out of their way to protect the trucks, to let the employer know, and then the follow-up to that should have been the employer having a plan in place in order to protect themselves in this kind of a situation, right? You should have a plan to address what happens when my workers go on strike. You know, you don't have any contingency plans in place whatsoever? I guess not. But again, that's not on the workers, that's on the employer, okay? And maybe negotiate with your workers so that they don't have to go on strike. Again, I mean, this entire situation is completely ridiculous. But they continue. They say because the company failed to make contingency plans around the strike, however, the concrete had to be offloaded and left to harden rather than delivered to customers. That should have been the end of it, but nearly 4 months later, Glacier sued Local 174 in state court, not at the NLRB, alleging tortious damages from the destruction of the concrete during the strike. So you're suing them because you didn't have a plan in place for the situation. Management, okay, the executives, the corporate structure of this company didn't have a plan in place to handle this kind of a situation, and you're going to sue the workers who went out of their way to protect the company's property, the trucks in this instance, to keep them running, to make sure that they weren't getting damaged in any way. And then because you didn't have a place, you had to dump the concrete, it hardened, and you lost some revenue because that wasn't able to go to customers. Well, guess what? That's how a fucking strike works. Okay, you know, if Walmart workers or Amazon workers go on strike one day at a warehouse and then some of those packages don't get shipped, you don't then get to turn around and sue that Amazon union that went on strike because, you know, you lost customers because, you know, they weren't able to deliver the packages. That's the whole point of a strike, is to withhold your labor value, to cost the company money so that they come to the table and actually have some, you know, impetus to engage in good faith bargaining with the unions. But they're just, again, trying to completely undercut all of this. They say on its face, Glacier is about whether the Teamsters Union owes money to a Washington concrete company, but the real purpose of pushing this case was to upend nearly 100 years of legal precedent and congressional intent by stripping the power from the NLRB, the federal agency charged with protecting workers' rights, to a collective action at work. They say under the standard of Garmin, if a lawsuit is brought in a state court over conduct arguably protected by federal labor law, which this would apply to this situation, say nonviolent peaceful direct action by workers, the state court must defer to the NLRB's determination of whether the contract was in fact protected. They say this lets the federal agency responsible for handling, that's not correct grammar, I don't think, but this lets the federal agency responsible for handling thousands of labor disputes every year decide which actions by workers are protected by the National Labor Relations Act from 1965 or whenever it was, rather than some random state court judge, most of whom hear only a few labor cases per year and still have little to no expertise on the field. They say pre-Garmin and pre-NLRA, state court interventions into labor disputes were almost uniformly disastrous for workers and unions. You don't say, creating legal uncertainty, fear, and a tool for employers to impose ruinous liability on workers taking collective action, and that's precisely the world that the powerful interests who had lined up in support of Glacier's argument, led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, hoped to achieve. So, I mean, again, this is a pretty simple situation, at least in my estimation. Number one, the Supreme Court shouldn't have even had to have made a decision on this case, because this should have been under the purview of the NLRB that has the authority to adjudicate these kinds of situations. So that's number one. You shouldn't have even been really making a ruling on this case. But number two, obviously they let it, you know, they made the decision in favor of the employer, and it looks like this union, I guess, is going to have to pay for some of these damages that were caused because the goddamn, you know, company didn't have a plan in place for a strike situation, right? Okay, so you're going to force these workers to pay, but it's still somewhat of a narrow ruling, so the NLRB is keeping some of its power. But then, oh, look at the horizon, and we have multiple Supreme Court justices within the conservative majority who are already looking to take this further, to further erode the ability for the National Labor Relations Board to do its job, which is protecting workers' rights in this country that are guarded under the National Labor Relations Act. So, I mean, again, this is part of this broader attempt by the GOP, by the conservative movement, by organizations like the Federalist Society, for example, in order to gut all of these federal agencies so that they can unleash the capitalist so-called free market in order to be able to allow these companies to get away with whatever the fuck they want while completely screwing over workers.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying